You lied on the record, and you lied to members of this committee. You violated court orders by not turning around deportation flights bound for El Salvador, where we know that hundreds of people under your leadership have reported that they were raped, they were beaten, and they nearly died. And your agents used chemical weapons in Chicago despite court orders from District Court Judge Ellis forbidding their use. Secretary Noem, you, Gregory Bovino, and your ICBP and DHS deputized agents have waged an unaccountable, unlawful, unconstitutional war against communities across the nation. Our residents have been surveilled, they've been threatened, they've been tear gassed, they've been hit with pepper balls, they've been shot, they've been subjected to warrantless arrest and precision immobilization maneuvers, they've been kidnapped and disappeared under your...
You just watched Congresswoman Ramirez stand in the well of a congressional hearing room and deliver what can only be described as a thermonuclear truth bomb directly into the face of state power. And let me tell you something about this moment, because it encapsulates everything we need to understand about where we are right now as a nation at this perilous crossroads of constitutional democracy versus authoritarian creep. And when I say authoritarian creep, I mean the methodical erosion of every check and balance that stands between us and outright fascism, which is what we're witnessing in real time as Kristi Noem was sworn in as the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security on January 25, 2025, and immediately commenced what historians will look back on as one of the most brazenly lawless campaigns of state violence against vulnerable populations in modern American history. This is not hyperbole, and this is not partisan exaggeration, because what Ramirez just cataloged in that searing indictment is a litany of constitutional violations so egregious, so flagrant, so openly contemptuous of judicial authority that it should shake every single person who cares about the rule of law to their absolute core. And I want you to understand the magnitude of what's happening here, because Noem defended her oversight of the president's mass deportation campaign, including signing off on sending more than 130 Venezuelan men to a Salvadoran mega-prison this year, under the Alien Enemies Acts. And this isn't some abstract policy disagreement. This is about human beings being disappeared into a foreign prison system, notorious for torture. Let's start with the El Salvador deportation flights, because this is where the depravity of this administration's immigration agenda becomes crystalline in its horror. And the Justice Department said in a court filing that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem made the decision to continue with deportation flights carrying migrants to a mega prison in El Salvador, despite a federal judge's order to turn the planes around. And I need you to absorb what that means, because we're talking about the Secretary of Homeland Security receiving a direct court order from a federal judge and making the calculated decision to ignore it, to defy it, to spit in the face of judicial authority, and continue shipping human beings to a notorious prison in El Salvador, where human rights groups have claimed they were subjected to torture and other abuses. And this occurred because Judge James Boasberg's March 15 oral order to return alleged Venezuelan members of the Tren de Aragua gang to the United States, as well as the subsequent written order the same day that blocked the federal government from removing members subject to the Alien Enemies Act, was simply disregarded, as though federal judges are mere suggestions to be consulted and discarded at will. This is the stuff of banana republics. This is the behavior of authoritarian regimes that have abandoned any pretense of being constrained by law. And when Ramirez says Noem lied to Congress, she's being surgically precise because the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Now let's talk about the Seacoast prison itself, because for 3 years El Salvador has been operating under a state of emergency that suspends fundamental rights as President Bukele wages an all-out assault on the country's powerful street gangs, and during that time some 84,000 people have been arrested, accused of gang ties and jailed, often without due process. And this is the facility, this is the hellscape to which Noem authorized the deportation of people who in many cases, lawyers representing about 30 Venezuelans said aren't gang members and have no criminal records. And even more damningly, the U.S. government has acknowledged that many do not have such records, which means we are witnessing the extrajudicial punishment of human beings based on nationality, appearance shipped off to a foreign torture facility without trial, without due process, without any of the constitutional protections that are supposed to be the bedrock of our legal system. And when Ramirez says people have been raped and beaten and nearly died, she's not engaging in rhetorical flourish, she's describing the documented reality of conditions in that prison. The Trump administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act, a law from 1798, designed for wartime to circumvent every protection afforded to people in removal proceedings. The Alien Enemies Act allows nationals of a country deemed an enemy of the U.S. to be detained and deported without due process of law, regardless of immigration status, which is a terrifying expansion of executive power that should alarm anyone who understands how quickly such mechanisms can be turned against any disfavored group. But wait, because it gets worse, and I need you to stay with me here, because the Chicago chemical weapons deployment is its own category of constitutional crisis, and on November 16th, U.S. District Court Judge Sarah L. Ellis issued an order forbidding federal agents from using riot control weapons, including tear gas, unless it's necessary to stop someone from physically harming another person as part of a lawsuit filed on behalf of Block Club Chicago and other media organizations, seeking to protect the First Amendment rights of journalists and peaceful protesters. And yet, despite this clear judicial directive, reporters gathered and reviewed 49 uses of tear gas and other chemical weapons since the start of October, and of these, 2/3 appear to have targeted peaceful demonstrators or bystanders, which means federal agents under Noem's command systematically violated a federal court order dozens of times, deploying chemical weapons against American citizens, exercising their First Amendment rights to protest and to report. Think about what that means. Think about the implications of federal law enforcement being given a direct order by a federal judge and responding by doing the exact thing they were ordered not to do, nearly 50 times. Judge Ellis highlighted violence federal agents waged on protesters and journalists in Broadview and Chicago, finding the chilling effect of defendants' conduct has impacted journalists' ability to report in violation of the Constitution, and this isn't happening in some far-flung authoritarian state. This is happening in Chicago. This is happening in American cities where federal agents are tear-gassing clergy members and journalists and families. The pattern of lawlessness extends to warrantless arrests, which represent a wholesale abandonment of Fourth Amendment protections, and a federal judge has ordered immigration agents to stop making warrantless arrests in Colorado based on suspected violations and to begin following federal law prohibiting detentions without first determining whether a person is a risk to run, and the ruling by Senior U.S. District Judge R. Brooke Jackson of Colorado is a comprehensive rejection of a tactic regularly used by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to meet quotas set by the Trump administration, and this same pattern has been documented across multiple jurisdictions, with a U.S. federal judge granting a preliminary injunction blocking the Department of Homeland Security from enforcing its policy of warrantless civil immigration arrests without probable cause of escape risk in Washington, D.C., and what we're seeing is federal law enforcement operating under the assumption that constitutional protections simply don't apply when it comes to immigration enforcement, that the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable seizures can be discarded whenever federal agents decide someone looks like they might be undocumented. White House officials set a daily nationwide arrest goal of 3,000 ICE arrests per day, with White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller telling agents to just go out there and arrest people, which is the literal definition of a police state mentality, where arrest quotas replace individualized suspicion and constitutional protections become obstacles to be circumvented rather than rights to be respected. Now I want to zoom out for a moment because this isn't just about immigration policy. This is about the architecture of authoritarianism and how it gets constructed brick by brick through the systematic dismantling of institutional constraints on executive power, and what we're witnessing is a Department of Homeland Security that has decided federal courts are advisory bodies whose orders can be ignored with impunity, and when Ramirez says Noem, Gregory Bovino and ICE and DHS deputized agents have waged an unaccountable, unlawful, unconstitutional war against communities across the nation. She's describing the reality that residents have been surveilled, threatened, tear-gassed, hit with pepper balls, shot, subjected to warrantless arrests, and what she calls precision immobilization maneuvers, which is bureaucratic language for violent takedowns, and people have been kidnapped and disappeared, which are words we typically associate with military juntas, not with the United States of America. And here's what makes this moment so critical, and why Ramirez's testimony today, December 11, 2025, needs to reverberate through every newsroom and every congressional office and every living room in America. Because Ramirez demanded a complete investigation into Secretary Noem's unlawful and potentially impeachable actions, accusing Noem of unethical behavior, pointing to reports that a firm tied to the DHS secretary allegedly received DHS contract money and that the Coast Guard spent $172 million to buy her 2 private jets, and alleging she made false and misleading statements to Congress about DHS and ICE operations, and accusing her of undermining the separation of powers by ignoring court orders, which means on top of the constitutional violations we have corruption, we have self-dealing, we have a cabinet secretary potentially funneling taxpayer money to connected firms, while simultaneously defying federal judges and lying to Congress. Ramirez wrote that Secretary Noem has established a clear pattern of lawless behavior, mirrored in the behavior of rank-and-file members of her leadership team, and when taken together, her actions violate her oath of office. And this is the language of impeachment. This is the framework for holding accountable a secretary who has placed herself above the law. Let me connect this to the broader historical context, because what we're seeing is a playbook that has been deployed throughout history by governments seeking to normalize the use of state violence against disfavored populations. And it always starts with a particular group, immigrants, in this case people who are characterized as dangerous, as criminal, as threats to national security, even when NBC News reported that ICE has arrested nearly 75,000 people with no criminal records, which directly contradicts Noem's repeated claims that they're only targeting the worst of the worst. And once you establish that this population is outside the protection of normal legal constraints, once you convince enough people that constitutional rights don't apply to them, then the apparatus of repression is in place, and it can be turned on anyone. And this is why the ACLU and civil rights organizations have been sounding alarm bells, because they understand that today it's undocumented immigrants being tear-gassed and arrested without warrants, but tomorrow it could be protesters or activists or journalists or anyone the state deems inconvenient. The deliberate flouting of court orders is particularly chilling because it represents a direct assault on the separation of powers and judicial independence. Trump earlier this year called for Judge Boasberg's impeachment, prompting a rare rebuke from Chief Justice John Roberts, who said the proper ways to respond to a disagreeable court ruling is to appeal it, and yet rather than following proper legal channels, the administration has simply decided to ignore judicial orders altogether. And Judge Ellis at times chided ICE officials and federal attorneys in open court, saying their statements often lack credibility, and expressed particular skepticism over a confrontation in which DHS said use of force was justified because Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino was hit in the head with a rock thrown by a demonstrator when video did not support the claim, and defendant Bovino admitted that he lied, which means we have federal officials lying under oath to federal judges, fabricating justifications for violence against protesters, and when caught in those lies, facing no consequences. This is the breakdown of accountability. This is what happens when an administration decides it is above the law, and will face no meaningful consequences for its lawlessness. And I need to emphasize the role of Greg Bovino here, because he keeps appearing in these stories as a roving commander of Border Patrol operations, deployed to cities across America, to oversee these enforcement blitzes. In an interview with CBS, Border Patrol Chief Greg Bovino called his agent's use of force exemplary, and declared that if someone strays into a pepper ball, he's defending the indiscriminate use of chemical weapons against civilians, and this is the mentality we're dealing with: federal agents who see themselves as warriors, engaged in combat rather than law enforcement officers, constrained by constitutional limits. And when Lawless order issued November 6 prohibited several methods of force, including pulling or shoving, and required federal agents to give warnings before deploying tear gas or other riot control weapons, and stipulated that almost all agents must wear clear identification and body cameras. These are the most basic requirements of accountability that should be standard operating procedure, and yet they had to be imposed by court order because the administration refused to voluntarily comply. The testimony that Ramirez references about U.S. citizens being detained is particularly damning, because it demolishes the administration's narrative that enforcement actions are carefully targeted. Ramirez cited a ProPublica story that reported more than 170 U.S. citizens have been held by immigration agents, and when she says they have been kicked, dragged, and detained for days, she's describing American citizens being subjected to unlawful detention by federal agents who are operating with such recklessness and such disregard for proper procedure that they're arresting people who have every legal right to be in this country. This isn't just about immigration enforcement run amok. This is about a federal agency that has become completely unmoored from legal constraints, operating as a rogue force answerable to no one. Now let's talk about the media suppression aspect, because the federal judge ruled that federal agents can't use tear gas, pepper spray, and other weapons against journalists and peaceful protesters after Block Club Chicago and others sued, and the temporary ruling comes after 4 Block Club journalists were indiscriminately hit by pepper spray bullets and tear-gassed by federal agents, and this is straight out of the authoritarian playbook, targeting journalists covering state violence to prevent documentation and reporting of abuses. And when Ellis found the chilling effect of defendants' conduct has impacted journalists' ability to report in violation of the Constitution, she's identifying a deliberate strategy to suppress coverage of immigration enforcement operations by making it physically dangerous for journalists to do their jobs. Pastor David Black told CNN that federal officers rushed out of the gate and began to shove us, describing their behavior as indiscriminate and vicious, saying he was drenched from the crown of my head to the socks in my shoes with chemical weapons, and this is a Presbyterian pastor engaged in peaceful protest, being soaked in chemical irritants by federal agents who are supposed to be bound by the First Amendment. The hearing today was remarkable, not just for Ramirez's withering cross-examination, but for what it revealed about the Republican response, which was to defend this lawlessness, to characterize any criticism of DHS as attacks on law enforcement. Republicans on the panel deflected blame from DHS and drew a direct line from the rhetoric of some Democrats opposed to ICE's tactics to physical attacks on law enforcement, with Rep. Andy Ogles saying Ramirez's comment pisses me off, and characterizing DHS agents as carrying out the rule of law, which is Orwellian doublespeak, because what DHS is doing is the precise opposite of following the rule of law. They are systematically violating federal law, violating court orders, violating constitutional rights, and when called to account for it, Republicans rush to their defense. This is how democracies die, not with a bang, but with a partisan coalition, deciding that their side's exercise of lawless power is justified and necessary, and patriotic. And then Noem had the audacity to leave the hearing early, claiming she needed to go to a FEMA Review Council meeting, which prompted one representative to joke, "I'm just going to take the position that she was scared of my questions," and as she walked out, protesters trailed her down the hallway yelling, "Shame on you." And this is what accountability looks like in a moment, when institutional mechanisms are failing, when a cabinet secretary can lie to Congress, defy federal judges, oversee a campaign of constitutional violations, and simply walk away when the questioning gets uncomfortable. The contempt for congressional oversight is palpable, and it's part of the same pattern we see throughout this administration, the belief that they answer to no one, that oversight is illegitimate, that courts are obstacles, and Congress is a nuisance. I want to be very clear about what's at stake here, because when Ramirez says this is an unaccountable, unlawful, unconstitutional war, she's not being melodramatic, she's being precise, and this matters for everyone, not just for immigrants, not just for people in Chicago or El Salvador, but for every single person who lives under a system where the executive branch is supposed to be constrained by law, and when those constraints are systematically dismantled, when cabinet secretaries can ignore judges, when federal agents can tear gas citizens and journalists with impunity, when arrest quotas replace individualized suspicion, then we no longer have a constitutional republic, we have the trappings of one, while the substance has been gutted. And this is why Ramirez's call for investigation and accountability is so urgent, because she told Noem, either you're going to resign, Trump's going to fire you, or you will be impeached, and she's drawing a line in the sand. She's saying that this level of lawlessness cannot be normalized, cannot be accepted, cannot become the new baseline of acceptable government conduct. The corruption allegations add another layer to this nightmare, because ProPublica announced that a firm tied to Noem had received $200 million in DHS ad contracts during the government shutdown, and the firm's strategy group has multiple ties with Noem and her political career, which if true represents a staggering level of self-dealing, using a cabinet position to funnel taxpayer money to politically connected firms, while simultaneously overseeing human rights abuses and defying federal courts. This is kleptocracy. This is the fusion of political power and personal enrichment that characterizes authoritarian regimes around the world. And when you combine corruption with lawlessness, with violence against vulnerable populations, you get a toxic mixture that is fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance. What Ramirez did today was refuse to normalize, refuse to treat this as just another policy disagreement, refuse to engage in the polite fictions that often characterize congressional hearings, and instead she called Noem a liar repeatedly on the record, and backed it up with evidence. And when asked whether it was her obligation as a member of the executive branch to honor decisions made by the highest court of land, Noem said, "We are abiding by all federal judges' orders," and Ramirez shot back that Noem violated court orders by not turning around deportation flights bound for El Salvador, despite a court order. And this is the moment where the lie is exposed in real time, where the secretary's bland assurances run headlong into the documented reality of her defiance. This is what effective congressional oversight looks like. This is how you hold power accountable, by refusing to accept obvious falsehoods, by confronting officials with the evidence of their lawlessness, by making clear that there will be consequences. The use of chemical weapons in American cities against American citizens deserves its own reckoning, because purchases analyzed include chemical weapons like the ones the agency has used against protesters in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Portland, Oregon, and over the last few months, ICE has been criticized for shooting pepper balls and using other non-lethal weapons indiscriminately and without warning against protesters, and ICE spending on guns, armor, and chemical munitions is over 600% more than what the agency spent from January to October 2024, which means there has been a deliberate and massive militarization of immigration enforcement, accompanied by the deployment of weapons typically reserved for riot control in war zones against people exercising their constitutional rights in American neighborhoods. One medical advisor for Physicians for Human Rights said, "The main thing with tear gas is that it's a pretty indiscriminate weapon," explaining you can't say, "Oh, I'm only trying to hit this one individual." Everybody disperses and it aerosolizes, it goes into the air, and then it kind of targets everybody in that space. She's describing why these weapons are particularly pernicious in residential areas, why their use represents a collective punishment inflicted on entire communities, and let's connect this to the broader landscape of Trump administration abuses, because House Democrats are increasingly turning to impeachment as their go-to cudgel against Trump cabinet officials, with Rep. Claywar Stevens filing articles of impeachment against Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. this week, and Rep. Sri Thanadar filing articles of impeachment against Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth last week. And while Republicans will dismiss this as partisan theater, the reality is that we're seeing unprecedented levels of cabinet-level lawlessness and corruption that demand constitutional responses. The impeachment mechanism exists precisely for moments when officials violate their oaths of office, when they place themselves above the law, when they wield their power in ways that threaten the constitutional order, and if Noem's conduct doesn't meet that threshold, then the concept of impeachment has been rendered meaningless. What we need right now is moral clarity, and Ramirez provided it today, by refusing to sugarcoat, by refusing to engage in euphemism, by calling lies lies and lawlessness lawlessness. And when she says people have been kidnapped and disappeared, she's using language that forces us to confront the reality that practices we associate with Latin American dictatorships in the 1970s are happening in the United States in 2025, under the authority of the Department of Homeland Security. This is the value of representatives who come from communities directly impacted by these policies, who understand viscerally what's at stake, who won't be gaslit into accepting the administration's sanitized version of events, because they've seen the tear gas canisters in their neighborhoods. They've heard from constituents whose family members have been arrested without warrants. They know the difference between the rhetoric of law and order and the reality of state-sanctioned violence. The El Salvador prison operations represent a particularly grotesque innovation in cruelty, because the Salvadoran government agreed to detain up to 300 alleged members of Tren de Aragua in return for $4.76 million, which means the United States is paying a foreign government to imprison people, many of whom have never been convicted of any crime, in a facility that operates outside any meaningful legal oversight. An ACLU attorney said that because the Trump administration is paying the government of El Salvador $6 million to imprison the men, he believes those men who were deported under the wartime law can be returned, and I think we very much think the federal court can order the U.S. to get them out, since they're constructively in U.S. custody, and the U.S. is apparently paying for it all. And El Salvador is doing it at the behest of the United States, which establishes that these people are effectively in U.S. custody, just outsourced to a foreign prison system, as a way to circumvent any domestic legal protections. This is rendition. This is the same logic that justified CIA black sites. This is finding ways to inflict punishment and abuse beyond the reach of U.S. courts and constitutional protections. We need to understand that every single one of these abuses, every court order defied, every person tear-gassed, every warrantless arrest represents not just a violation of individual rights, but an assault on the entire framework of constitutional democracy. Because the rule of law is not self-executing, it depends on officials choosing to follow it, on institutions enforcing compliance, on courts having their orders respected. And when an administration decides that courts are merely advisory, that constitutional rights are obstacles to be circumvented, that Congress can be lied to with impunity, then the whole structure begins to collapse. This is why Ramirez's testimony matters. This is why her demand for investigation and accountability matters. Because in this moment, we need officials who will stand up and say, this is unacceptable. This cannot continue. This violates everything we claim to stand for as a nation. The precision with which Ramirez laid out her case is important, because she didn't just make allegations. She provided specifics. She cited court cases. She referenced news reports. She played video clips, and then confronted Noem with her own words. And when Noem tried to defend her actions by saying, the decisions made on deportations, where flights go and when they go, are my decision at the Department of Homeland Security, and we will continue to do the right thing, continue to work and protect Americans, no matter what radical judge comes out and tries to stop us. She's openly declaring her intention to defy judicial authority. She's saying that she will continue to violate court orders because she considers judges who rule against her to be radical and therefore illegitimate. This is the rhetoric of authoritarianism. This is a cabinet secretary declaring herself above judicial review, and the fact that she said this openly in a congressional hearing shows how normalized this lawlessness has become, how confident this administration is that there will be no meaningful consequences. So what do we do with this moment? Because despair is not a strategy, and resignation is not an option, and what Ramirez modeled today is the kind of fearless confrontation with power that this moment demands. She didn't pull punches. She didn't worry about decorum. She named the reality of what's happening, and she demanded accountability. And we need more of that energy throughout Congress, throughout the media, throughout civil society, because the only way to resist the normalization of authoritarianism is to refuse to normalize it, to keep calling it out, to keep fighting back through every available mechanism, legal, political, social. The courts are doing their job issuing orders restricting unlawful conduct, and the administration is defying those orders, which means we need enforcement mechanisms. We need Congress to use its power of the purse to defund these operations. We need state and local officials to refuse cooperation. We need ongoing mass mobilization to make clear that this lawlessness is unacceptable, and we need media coverage that doesn't both sides this, that doesn't treat constitutional violations as just another partisan disagreement, but names them as the crisis they represent. And finally, I want to say that the people who are bearing the brunt of this violence, the undocumented immigrants being arrested and detained and deported, the communities being tear-gassed, the families being separated, they are not abstractions. They are human beings with dignity and rights, and their treatment is a measure of who we are as a society. And when we allow an administration to systematically abuse the most vulnerable among us, when we shrug and say, well, they shouldn't have been here illegally, when we accept the premise that some people are outside the protection of law, then we have ceded the moral and constitutional high ground, and we have enabled the construction of an apparatus of repression that will not confine itself to its initial targets. This is the lesson of history. This is why we must resist, not just out of concern for immigrants, but out of recognition that constitutional rights are indivisible, that an administration willing to tear gas protesters and defy judges and lie to Congress in service of its immigration agenda will not suddenly rediscover constitutional constraints when it comes to other issues. Ramirez understands this. She's fighting not just for her constituents, but for the principle that no one is above the law, that executive power must be constrained, that courts must be respected, that human rights are not negotiable, and her courage today should inspire all of us to keep fighting, to refuse to accept this nightmare as normal, to demand accountability, and to work toward a future where the rule of law actually means something again.